So I wrote this book, War is a Lie, in part because I was disturbed by this idea that the Iraq War was somehow different from other wars in that it was based on a lie. I had a lot of smart people telling me that this was unique, that never before had such a disgrace occurred, a president lying about wars. Absolutely unheard of. And yet, of course, if you go back and look at any wars, all wars that have been recorded, and what we can guess about wars since they've been around, which is probably about 12,000 years or so, you just can't find any that aren't based on lies from all sides of the wars. And just looking back at our own country, at the Gulf of Tonkin incident that didn't occur, at the sinking of the Maine, that there was no evidence Spain sank, at the sinking of the Lusitania, which we knew perfectly well was full of weapons and troops. And you go back through all the wars, and there's always a lie, or two, or 18, to get the war started. And they're often contradictory lies. They're lies about the evil people that we have to go after, the evil dictator of Iran or North Korea. Whether their evils are domestic and unrelated to anyone outside their country or not, we also have to attack them to defend ourselves, because they are about to come after us because they're so evil, even if they're an impoverished nation halfway around the world that would be committing immediate suicide if they were to attack us. And at the same time, we have to go have a war against a country as a humanitarian act, out of the goodness of our hearts, for their sake, to spread democracy, to help them out. We can't abandon them in their time of need, whether they want it or not. And then you look more and more at the wars and what we're told about the wars as they progress, and as lies are exposed and abandoned, and you have a constant cycle of new lies about a given war and completely different lies about a lot of wars after the fact and decades after the fact. Lies about what wars were for that weren't what the wars were for at the time they were happening, including lies about what the Civil War was for and lies about what World War II was for. And we have a situation where typically now we have a majority of Americans who believe obvious, blatant lies, playing on their emotions, manipulating them when it's time to go into a war. And this was the case with Iraq and with Afghanistan. And then years later, you have a majority of Americans saying, oops, that was a mistake. We shouldn't have done that. And my vision is that we might somehow get to the point where we say, no, we don't want to do that at the time, when the war is going to start, not years later when it's so hard to get them to end a war. You know, if we could have a majority against before they started. And arguably for years now we've had that with Iran, to our great credit. But we're going to have to keep that up. We haven't won that one yet. And so in the book I didn't try to go chronologically war by war through all the wars, even of one nation, because it would get so repetitive and be an encyclopedia. I went with themes, and I'll just give you the table of contents to give you the idea. Wars are not fought against evil. Wars are not launched in defense. Wars are not waged out of generosity. These are the chapter titles. Wars are not unavoidable. Warriors are not heroes. War makers do not have noble motives. Wars are not prolonged for the good of soldiers. Wars are not fought on battlefields. Wars are not won and are not ended by enlarging them. War news does not come from disinterested observers. War does not bring security and is not sustainable. Wars are not legal. Wars cannot be both planned and avoided. And war is over if you want it. Borrowing, of course, from John and Yoko. Because of what's happening these days, I just want to talk a little bit about one particular war and then see if you have questions or discussion. And that's Afghanistan. we have this review coming out tomorrow, or at least a summary of it coming out tomorrow on the so-called progress in Afghanistan. And we're being told that at the end of 2014, so that's 4 more years of $2 billion a week and how many deaths and how much hostility, at the end of 2014, they're going to rename it a non-combat war. That is to say, they're going to scale down to 50,000, 100,000 troops plus mercenaries and contractors in greater numbers than the troops, and they're going to announce that all the combat troops have left. So all the troops there doing the combat are non-combat troops. The situation that we have now in Iraq. That's 4 years from now. That's the plan, to do that, if you can believe anything that these people say. It's very hard for me to understand why we wouldn't do that now, when people are more likely to believe that nonsense, or do it in 40 years. Why 4 years? But that's what they're going to be announcing tomorrow. And so, sort of skimming through the themes of the book, the first chapter, the idea that wars are not fought against evil. When you look at Afghanistan, the evil that we've been told we're fighting against is Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda and 9/11. And yet we know that the Taliban was willing to hand bin Laden over to be put on trial by a third country, even without the United States providing any evidence, both before and after September 11th. And the White House was not interested. Not long after we invaded Afghanistan, the president remarked that he was not very interested in bin Laden, and we did not pursue prosecution of alleged criminals. Instead, we had a beautiful excuse for war. The best excuse, I think, that has ever been concocted. Rather than the communist threat that we could see behind every tree, we have the terrorist threat. And unlike the communist threat, the terrorist threat can never be proven to have been eliminated. It's there, always. And as long as anyone is resisting anything we are doing, there will be terrorism, because that's the definition of terrorism, resisting anything the United States is doing. And so rather than treat this as a crime, rather than treat it, say, as a bombing in Oklahoma City, where we discover that it wasn't foreign Muslims who did it, and therefore it's not that big a deal, and we prosecute the criminals, rather than the First World Trade Center bombing attempt where we prosecute the criminals, where we put people in prison. We wanted an excuse for war, and we wanted an excuse to go into other countries for war. It's as if there was a bombing in Oklahoma City and we bombed the whole state of Oklahoma flat and then went and bombed Oregon flat for good measure. We wanted to go into Iraq too. And had we captured bin Laden and put him on trial, we wouldn't have had that evil demon, which is a necessary part of war propaganda for going in to Iraq. Revenge is not actually a legal case for war. It's not actually a justification for war. It's a backwards, primitive emotion. And so the primary initial lie for the war on Afghanistan was all the underlying lies that make us think that revenge is an excuse for war. And this was a far better leading lie for a war than Iraq has weapons, right? Because the idea that the underlying lies, the idea that wars can be legal, the idea that being tough will make you safer, the idea that war is something targeted and surgical that takes out the bad guys and can be better than the thing it's being used to remedy, all of those lies underlie the surface level lies. But the surface level lie on Iraq, the idea that weapons justified a war, right, was, you know, lunacy to begin with. You can't have wars against nations because they have weapons, or anyone can have wars against us. But those weapons could be immediately shown not to be there, right? We all knew they weren't, many of us knew they weren't there to begin with. We knew they didn't justify a war anyway if they were there, but they were immediately discovered not to be there. the superiority with Afghanistan, the reason why people say, oh, Iraq's the bad war, Afghanistan's the good war, is that you couldn't discover something immediately to have been false. It's a permanent lie. We must have revenge. It can never be shown to have been exhausted. We always need more revenge. And so we're there for that. Then you have the lie of defense, that we're in Afghanistan to defend ourselves. God forbid we fight aggressive wars. No, we fight defensive wars. We go to the poor nations halfway around the globe to make them worse off than they are, to defend ourselves. And this is based, it's based on an illegal and very twisted idea of defense to begin with. That is, that you go and preemptively fight wars against someone who might play a part in a war against you if you don't go get them first, which is not within the legal understanding of a defensive war. But the facts have been acknowledged that Al-Qaeda is not in Afghanistan, that the Taliban is not on the best of terms with Al-Qaeda, that were the Taliban to have power in Afghanistan, which is not guaranteed were the United States to leave today, it would be very unlikely to empower Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. And were Al-Qaeda able to operate freely in Afghanistan, it would not make the United States the least bit less safe. Al-Qaeda is operating in numerous countries around the world, and what empowers them is the rage and the hostility that we build by kicking in people's doors, bombing people's roofs, stopping people's cars, and killing innocent people in Afghanistan and elsewhere. And people like the late Richard Holbrooke have acknowledged that all of this is false, and then made those same claims, pushed those same lies again and again. Then you have the lie of humanitarian war, that we're there in Afghanistan to help the Afghans whether they like it or not. And this is fundamentally based on the idea that war is not the worst thing in the world, that there's something worse that a war can fix, that bombing people and blowing limbs off women and children can be done for women's rights. And so you have groups, civil groups, women's groups in Afghanistan, the Revolutionary Association of Women of Afghanistan, who say the longer the occupation goes, the worse the post-occupation period will be. It's our country. Get out. Just as were we occupied by the Canadians or the Chinese, and they were benevolent and we were in anarchy and we had no idea what would happen when they left, what is the very first demand that almost every American would make of the benevolent occupiers?
Get out.
Get out. Get the hell out of our country, which is what the Afghans say, which is what, in polls conducted by the U.S. military, which is what the Iraqis say and have been saying for years. And yet we have a group of Americans that wants to wipe these people off the face of the earth. We have another group of Americans that wants to occupy them for their own good, whether they like it or not. And you have these conflicting rationales for the same war, both operating effectively at the same time. Well, now failing, now we have a majority against these wars, but you still have a strong minority, and you still have these arguments out there convincing people, or partially convincing people. Then you have the lie that these things are unavoidable, that it's not up to us, we're forced into it, it's our last resort, we didn't have a choice. And in the book I go into, you know, this baseless idea that war is in our genes, that we can't get rid of wars. When nations have gotten rid of wars, have been warrior states and have ceased to be, when the majority of human societies have not known war. It's absolutely baseless to say that we can't do without war, and that we don't have ready alternatives in each case to war. If you look at the WikiLeaks cables on what the European Union president had to say to us about the war in Afghanistan, he admits, just as all of our top officials admit privately or otherwise, that it's hopeless, it's pointless, there's nothing going to be accomplished. But out of deference to the United States, the European Union will continue with the war in Afghanistan. this is deference that the people of the United States can do without. The majority of us are against this and not asking for it and didn't know about it until we had a cable leaked by some treasonous Australian who dared to tell us what our government might be up to. The other lies you have are all the lies that minimize the real motives for a war. Right? We're in Afghanistan because of where it's located, because we want bases there. NATO's plan is to have weapons, including nuclear weapons, there, near lots of strategic places in the world. We can't resist that. We want a gas pipeline through Afghanistan. We want the profits that come from the war and the reconstruction. There are all kinds of power and economic motives that drive these wars, and they get mentioned. They're openly mentioned in hearings and in think tank events, and occasionally on page 15. They're not secret, but they're not over and over again on the front page and on the television. And instead, we hear reasons that you hear about very seldom or not at all in private discussions. When I was reading about all kinds of wars for this book, and I look at private discussions that come out decades later, and you see what they were talking about behind closed doors, there are things you just never hear, ever, including supporting the troops. Not once have I seen war planners in a closed-door planning meeting express the slightest interest in continuing a war for the sake of the troops. And yet, that's what you hear in almost every conversation in public. But then, when I went through, and I published an article on this today at a great website called the Black Agenda Report. But when you've exhausted all the phony reasons for wars, and you've exhausted all the seemingly more important rational reasons for wars, it's still hard to explain a lot of the wars without irrational motivations, without ego and machismo, and when the Pentagon Papers came out, I think maybe the most scandalous story was the fact that in internal discussions they were talking about 70% of the reason that they were continuing in Vietnam was to save face, to not have the humiliation of leaving. And in fact, you look at their discussions for years, and they know there's no point. They know it's hopeless. They know it's a question of how much blood, how much treasure before you leave, and they just keep it going. And the people who argue to keep it going see their careers advance in the Pentagon, in the State Department, in the White House, and anybody who suggests otherwise is ostracized as weak. And this is not just Vietnam. This is one example of every war discussed by war planners in Washington, D.C. And you see them discuss not just what reason should we give the public for a war. We'll start our marketing plan in September, as Andrew Card said, but what motive to give themselves? They're predetermined to have a war, to escalate the war, to keep the war going, and they have to figure out what reason to give each other. And then deciding what reasons to give the public is a step beyond that. So there's an element of insanity here. The other argument that's I was going to say killing us. It's not us that it's killing, but the other argument that's driving the war in Afghanistan is the lie about a surge in Iraq. And when President Obama gave his remarks on Iraq and Afghanistan from the Oval Office, and he embraced the whole line of lies about Iraq, starting with the weapons of mass destruction on through, it was when he got to the surge that he then pivoted and went to Afghanistan and talked about Afghanistan, because we have this accepted lie right now that if you're in a bad war, the way to get out and to fix things is to escalate it, right? If something's not working, do more of it. And normally, you wouldn't think that was what you wanted to do, right? When everybody went out and voted against the wars and put in the Democrats instead of the Republicans in 2006, it wasn't so they would escalate it in 2007. And in fact, that is not what did any good in Iraq. And as I documented at length in the book, trends toward less violence in Iraq were long-standing and were the result of other factors, and factors that are not there in Afghanistan. And the arguments for where increases in troops had any beneficial impact in Iraq are ludicrous. This was an attempt to escalate before you draw down in Iraq, and to credit an escalation with having a beneficial impact in a war, rather than simply drawing down or withdrawing, which would be shameful and humiliating. But it's based on lies, and those lies are really hurting us. Then, as with any war, you have the lies about progress, right? Here we are in Afghanistan, everything worse than last year. More violence, more deaths, less support for us or for the government in the polls. Everything on a downward trend, and we keep getting these reports, as we will tomorrow, on progress. People have to have this idea of progress, of success around the corner, or support for a war plummets. And then we have the more fundamental lies that keep the idea around that we should have any of these wars at all, or that even if these wars are wrong, there might be a good war coming around next month. And the idea that we can survive this agenda economically. I address all of these at length in the book, and we can talk about them here, but just briefly, war is destroying our economy. Investing so much in the military and in wars is destroying the rest of the economy. We are going to have to choose, just economically, whether to keep this going or not. And even the Cat Food Commission, even the deficit hawks are proposing to cut $100 billion out of the military. And Congress simply will not hear of that unless we force them to. The idea that we can continue to have something to call a democracy with representative government, with civil liberties, in a time of war, without end, without boundary, with a president capable of announcing new policies of assassinating American citizens and so forth, is just ludicrous. We will end this militarism, or we will lose this republic. The idea that we can environmentally survive this war machine is a joke. The U.S. military is the single biggest consumer of oil, the single biggest destroyer of the environment. War ruins nations and ruins the nation pushing the war. We cannot continue with these wars, and until we get environmental groups and environmental activists focused on opposing wars, and those who tried this in Cancun this week got nowhere. We are done for. We cannot continue with our policies that are proliferating nuclear weapons. Apparently, we are interested in getting nuclear weapons into Iraq, of all places, sometime soon. We cannot continue this without destroying the world. The more nations that have nuclear weapons, the more nations that will want them, the more opportunities there will be to get them, and the more opportunities for non-nation actors to get them. And we cannot survive the predictable blowback. We have seen an increase in global terrorism predictably through the course of the war, the global war on terror, and to continue that with the idea that we won't is the definition of insanity. I want to read you something that somebody sent me today. It's not very long. This was a woman named Kathy Kelly, who's a great U.S. peace activist who's been in Afghanistan and is back there now. And she got this statement from a couple of groups called Afghan Youth Peace Volunteers and Afghans for Peace. And this is a letter that they've put together in very imperfect English, very, very strange English, but I think maybe in some ways beautiful compared to ordinary English. And at the bottom is all kinds of documentation of polling, of the fact that they are speaking in this regard for a majority of Afghans. I won't read you all of it, but most of it. We want you out. An open letter from the Afghan Youth Peace Volunteers and Afghans for Peace. To all the leaders of our world, the leaders of the US-led coalition, the Afghan government, the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, and regional countries, we are intolerably angry. All our senses are hurting. Our women, our men, and yes, shame on you, our children are grieving. Your Afghan civilian military strategy is a murderous stench we smell, see, hear, and breathe. President Obama and all the elite players and people of the world, why? America's $250 million annual communications budget just to scream propaganda on this war of perceptions with its nauseating rhetoric mimicked by Osama and other warlords is powerless before the silent wailing of every anemic mother. We will no longer be passive prey to your disrespectful systems of oligarchic, plutocratic war against the people. Your systems feed the rich and powerful. They are glaringly unequal. They do not listen, do not think, and worst, they do not care. We choose not to gluttonize with you. We choose not to be trained by you. We choose not to be pawned by you. We henceforth refuse every weapon you kill us with, every dollar you bait us with, and every lie you manipulate us with. We are not beasts. We are Afghans, Americans, Europeans, Asians, and global citizens. Yes, you have the false, self-appointed power to arrest us over expressing the public opinion of ordinary folk, students, farmers, shepherds, laborers, teachers, doctors, people who now have nowhere to turn and nowhere to hide. This world public opinion against the Afghan war has been clearly expressed and is larger than any number of WikiLeaks you seek to suppress. So come arrest us all as we civilly disobey you. Come arrest us all. Yes, you have the army, police, and apparatchik to smother us and to bribe those who are Pavlov reflexed to money. But you cannot stop us from restoring our voice. We refuse to prostitute our hearts and minds. We refuse you. Not you, the human person, but you, the greedy system of self-interested power. Again and again, here in Afghanistan, we have seen a hope of nonviolence light up. Every day we see a yearning for humane relationships, and because of this, love is how we now firmly take our stand. How does trillion deficit killing followed by the strategy of escalated killing and yet another review for more killing work? How does it make anyone safer? How does it solve the incorruptible corruption, unequaled inequality, and inviolate violence we face daily? Your policies, skewedly diagnosed and reviewed in a cold, clinical manner divorced from reality, have been deaf to the concerns and needs of the people. Thus we endeavor to have a People's Afghanistan December review, because that's what ordinary people can do. We would try not to throw our shoes at you. We would try to recognize the better side of all human beings and thus continue to serve our commoners' tea and bread to one and all. But we do ask, plead, and demand that you stop your unsustainable superpower militarism. We want peace. We want you out. With singular sincerity, Afghanistan Youth Peace Volunteers, Afghans for Peace. So I'll stop there, but a couple of announcements. Tomorrow at 9 o'clock in the morning in the National Press Club in Washington, D.C., and you are all invited and everyone you know is invited, there will be a press conference with a group called Get Up, which is an Australian online activist group that has raised tons of money and collected, I think, near 100,000 signatures now on a statement to our president and our Attorney General demanding legal and just treatment for Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. And Daniel Ellsberg and Ray McGovern and Mike Ferner of Veterans for Peace and others will be there speaking in solidarity with this group, which will have its statement in a full-page ad tomorrow in the New York Times and the Washington Times and so forth. I would encourage all of you who want to come to Washington, D.C. To join us there. And then at 10 o'clock, we're going to go a couple blocks away to the White House. And we really don't care if it's snowing or cold. And we're going to have a rally against these wars with a group called Veterans for Peace leading the way. A veteran for peace who's given me a ride up there, John Heuer, is one of our better activists around these parts, and he's up here from North Carolina, and we are going to engage in civil resistance, and we are going to take our message to the White House that the majority of Americans and Afghans and the world want these wars ended, reviewed or not. And at 2 o'clock, there will be a protest in support of WikiLeaks at the Justice Department. And I would encourage you all, if you can make it, to come to DC tomorrow. I know there's at least one car that John and I are taking. Is anybody else? Raise your hand if you're even thinking about going to Washington tomorrow. One over here. So at least 2 cars probably. So think about it. There's empty seats. And whether you can make it to DC or not, you can get involved in these organizations and these efforts. If you go to defundwar.org, not defend war, but defundwar.org, you'll find links to all kinds of groups and resources that are working now on this agenda of moving the money from where over 50 cents of every income tax dollar goes to places where we could actually use it. And there are cities around the country passing resolutions saying we don't want our money. Resolutions sent to Congress saying no more money for these wars. Here are things we want the money for. Charlottesville, Lynchburg, Danville, any towns around here should be doing this. So please get involved. And thanks for coming out here tonight. And if you have any questions, raise your hand and introduce yourself if you want to.